Hey, Matt, today I'll show you how to build this miter station that's perfect for small shops. It's only 6 feet long by 24 inches deep, but it does have an extension wing that adds another 3 feet of support for those longer boards. I also added a stop block system so we can make repeatable cuts, and it has dust collection, extra storage, and a lot more. If you stick around to the end, I'll tell you what I've done wrong here. I've made some mistakes and how you shouldn't do them. And I'll also tell you how I'm going to control the dust on that wall, because that seems to be a common question. First step in my process was laying out exactly where I wanted this new miter station to be. I even set the miter saw, the router table, and the bandsaw up just to kind of give me an idea of how everything's going to lay out. From there, I started breaking down the plywood. I'm using my track saw here, but you can use a straight edge and a circular saw, a table saw, whatever you use to break down sheet goods. First thing we're going to do is build the base cabinet just like you see here. After I cut them to width, then I cut them to the height that I was going to be using for the base cabinet. To lay out for the toe kick, all I did was lay out a 3-inch by 3-inch square and then put painter's tape down. That painter tape is going to keep you from tearing out the plywood when you cut it with a jigsaw. Jigsaws are notorious for tearing out plywood especially. But as you can see, this comes out super clean. Next thing I did was take it to the table saw and rip off 3-inch strips. I ripped several of these, and we're going to use these to build the base cabinet structure, as you see here. Shake the dust off, then we're going to get ready to cut them to length. Sucker's heavy. First cut on the new saw, we're going to use the saw to build the thing that the saw is going to sit on. So, miter station inception. Perfect. So using the saw for the first time, I was actually pretty impressed with the dust collection so far. Next thing I did was break out my Maskey M2 pocket hole jig and start drilling pocket holes for the braces so we can join everything together. You're going to need to drill 2 pocket holes on each end of all the braces. Also, I'm drilling 4 pocket holes on each side of the bottoms of the cabinet. After the pocket holes are drilled, I just set up everything and started gluing and screwing it together. Timber! These corner clamps help hold everything in place so long as you clamp it before letting go. I just measured from the bottom of the cabinet to the bottom of the structure 3 inches. That's going to give us that 3-inch toe kick we want. And then just drive those 1 1/4 pocket hole screws in. Make sure everything's nice and flush before you drive those screws. This is what the first cabinet should look like, and we're going to join 2 more with this to make our base cabinet. But first I wanted to set it in place, make sure everything measured out right, and double check everything. If you missed part 1 of this video where I installed this tool storage wall, I'll put that at the end of this video, or I'll link it in the description. You can check that out. Now I'm going to make one just like that, attach it to the 28-inch base. So we're going to have 2 28-inch bases and then a smaller base, so we complete a 6-foot long cabinet. If you like what you see so far, hit that subscribe button, click that bell icon so you get notified of all the new content we've got coming. That's what your cabinet should look like at this point. I took mine off the workbench and put it on the floor laying face down. And from there, I just checked the square, made sure it was perfectly square or very close to that before actually attaching the back. Small shop problems have to raise the garage door to rip anything longer than about 4 or 5 feet. So I'm ripping down this 1/4-inch plywood, and this is going to be our backing. Make sure you use glue and then brad nails to attach this. This is going to make your structure very solid. In other words, it's not going to rock or sway on you. Then I just set that cabinet in place. Use my crosscut sled to cut 3-inch by 3-inch blocks, and we're going to attach those to the bottom of the base cabinet. Because my garage floor is so unlevel, I need to add leveling feet. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to add those blocks and then drill into those and attach those leveling feet. That way we can level the cabinet. You could also add casters here if you wanted a mobile base. Using the Viking arm helps me kind of keep everything held in place while I adjust the legs. There it is, nice and level. Now I put on the top. Well, this is the first top. I just drove 1-inch screws from underneath and attached the top. I'm curious what miter saw you use. Comment below and let me know. Check that out. That's looking good. So what I'm gonna do now is build some ledges, or basically spaces for drawers, but also some support on each side there. So now we gotta figure out where to put these so that none of the top interferes with the operation of the saw left and right. This saw actually has a little bit of a tab on the left, so we're gonna have to account for that because that top piece will be something similar to that. And you also have to remember when the saw comes around that the back isn't gonna contact back there. I decided to break out the Craig 720 because I haven't used it in a very long time and I felt bad for it. So we're using it here to drill a few more pocket holes. You know what time it is, power tip time. When you build or cut your risers for the top to lay on, you want to make these a little taller than what your saw is. I'm going to go a 1/2 inch taller, and there's a reason why. If I cut it to fit exact, it's at a perfect level like this, then that'll work pretty good, right? Unless you swap saws. If you get a different saw, and if you're like me building these for plans for people, there's no way to adjust for the height of different saws. So what you do, instead of cutting these exactly right, cut them a 1/2 inch taller. That way, everything is raised up a 1/2 inch, or you can go however high you want, but I'm going a 1/2 inch. And then you can shim your saw to meet the level of your tabletop. That way it'll fit almost any saw. Should fit any saw within a 1/2 inch of that. I would double check that if you get the plans for this. Double check that so that you make sure that there's enough clearance there so that you can shim your saw up. You can't shim it back down when you build it like this, but you can always shim it up. So after a little reconsidering, I'm going to move this back to 4 inches because I just would rather be safe than sorry. And a little bit of extra clearance there is not gonna hurt anything. See how much that's going to give me? About 1 inch and a little bit over 1 inch. I have this little piece here that snaps or pushes down so that it locks everything down. I want to be able to have a pretty good distance around all this stuff. Also, make sure you turn your pocket holes that way or you'll be able to see them once everything's finished on this outside edge looking down. So you don't want to do that. It's important to get these square because we're going to be putting drawers in. We got this one on, and now we're just going to double check everything before we move on. That way, if anything needs to be moved, now is the time. So I've set the top piece up here, and I got to cut this angle so that when the saw comes around, it clears that, right? So all I did was set it up here, get it nice and square, flushed up there, flushed up here, and then flushed up on this end. And then I just took a pencil, reached under and marked the end of this upright and the end of this upright. And now I can just draw a line and then cut that angle without having to try to do a whole lot of figuring it out. I cut the top for the left side to length using the track saw and then double checked that it was where I wanted it. Before we put the top on, it's going to be so much easier. I wish I'd have done it over there and I forgot, but it'll be so much easier to go ahead and install these drawer slides now versus when the top is on. I'm going to flush these up. I'm going to take a piece of 3/4 inch plywood because that's the drawer front face will be that, and we'll be able to flush that right up to the front of this. And then there will be some trim on the outside that'll kind of inset the drawer. You'll see what I mean later, but go ahead and install these now. Just using a piece of 3/4 inch scrap so that it raises it up just a little bit. Got a whole video on installing and making drawers if you want to check that out for full details. Because this one is inset, I'm going to create basically a square drawer and put a square face on it. It'll just set further in. If you want to do an angle face, I guess you could do that, but I have set both of these in the same distance that it's going to be flush here and then also the same across there. So to attach the top on the left side, I just used glue and brad nails. They worked perfectly fine on my previous miter station. And this is why you want to install drawer slides before you put the top on. I basically got the bit in my hand with the screw and I'm just reaching in there. I tried the right angle attachment, but it's just too cramped on this side. So be sure and don't be like me, but I'm just going to reach in and do the best I can. Do this before you put the top on. I just cut some hardwood shims to put under each side just to raise it up. And then if these are too thick, then I can always shave it down on the table saw. It feels a little proud. I'm gonna shave just a smidgen off just to lower it a little bit. Yeah, we're talking less than a 1/16 on each side. I'll shave them down just a little and we'll go with that. I went ahead and used one of those 3-inch strips for the toe kick, and I just used glue and brad nails to attach that in place. I went ahead and set in the dust collection at this point because I had to drill a hole through one wall into the other cabinet so that I could attach this Y. And this is going to let me split off a hose for the saw and for cleanup. Got blast gates on there, the whole nine. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Also drilled holes in the back of the cabinet so it gives ventilation for the dust extractor. Next thing I did was add some shelving to the cabinet on the left. That's going to give me some more storage options. We're just going to use pocket holes to hold those in place. They work perfectly fine for this application. That's what it should look like at this point. Next, I'm gonna trim this out in walnut. You can use whatever you want. You can use edge banding. You can leave the plywood edge exposed, whatever you want for your shop. But I'm gonna use walnut, and it's gonna take very little of this because I'm cutting it in 1/8 inch strips. Once I get those strips cut out, I just measure them and cut them to length, and then use glue and pin nails to hold them on. For this wide one, I actually had a piece of 8/4 long enough to create one long strip. That way we wouldn't have to piece it. And that's what I did here, was just cut a piece out with a track saw. I want this piece to fit in there on that angle, because if you do a square, then you're gonna wind up with a gap right there, and I don't want that. So I've cut this angle to fit perfectly there. And how I got that, I'm sure there's a million ways to do it, but I just took a little square and held flush there, and then an angle finder to get up to the square. It wound up being just shy of a 22.5 degree angle. I added some trim to those shelves, and that's gonna make that door shut perfectly flush, so it just worked out for me. Next thing to do is install this T-track. I set my bit to the same height as the T-track, just a smidgen lower, and then I moved the saw out of the way, installed some blocks on each end with some brad nails, and that way I don't have any tear out when I start or finish the cut. I remove those blocks, then I cut the T-track to length, used some CA glue to give it a little extra gripping power, and then installed that T-track using screws. I'm going to be putting down a stick-on tape measure on the back side of the T-track to help me measure cuts. This PowerTech I put down, checked the measurement, and it's actually very inaccurate. So I'm going to take that up, and I've already ordered a Craig one to replace this. I'll put a link to the Craig one in the description below, but this one I wouldn't recommend. I really like this smaller stop block that I picked up too. Now it's time to build the cabinet doors. Dang it. I cut these doors out so that there would be about a 1/16 inch clearance on all 4 sides. I'm sure nobody else does this. Just a wee bit short. I set the saw at 29 7/8 instead of 30 7/8, so it's a good thing I only cut one. I can use that for a drawer before I caught it. We'll call that a win. These, for the drawer faces, I went ahead and cut those before I made the drawers just because I want to. So all I did was measure the height and the width, and then subtracted an 1/8 inch each so that I would have a 1/16 inch gap all the way around. And I wanted the pattern or the grain to run the same way as the doors, so I made sure to cut them in that direction. To build the drawers, I ripped them out on the table saw, then went over to the miter saw and cut them all to length. I used my Craig setup block here to raise the blade a 1/4 inch, and then also set the fence a 1/4 inch away from the blade, and then ripped a 1/4 inch groove in every one of these. Once I had all of those cut, I moved the fence over about the blade's width and then cut another groove. That's going to allow that 1/4 inch plywood to fit in there perfectly. Then from there, just glue and brad nail these together. There's no special joiner or anything going on here. These are perfectly acceptable for shop drawers, and I've got several in the shop already that have held up perfectly fine. Next thing we're gonna do is just install the drawer slides. Very simple to do. Just drive the screws and get them all fitted in. One thing I did do is on the 2 left drawers, I made them 20 inches long. On the 2 drawers closest to the saw, they're 18 inch long, but I did use 20 inch drawer slides so I get that full reveal. So we got to drill holes for these hinges to operate in, and the way these work, this piece gets drilled down in there and we screw that on, and then this piece gets attached to the cabinet, and then they just snap in together. These are called European Blum hinges. This makes it super easy to attach these type hinges. This is a Craig drawer hinge or door hinge jig. You just flush it up on the bottom. You can set the distance away from the edge using these little adjustments to be more or less. And it has a built-in Forstner bit with a built-in depth stop so you don't go too deep. I did make a test cut just to make sure that it wasn't going to go too deep, and it was far enough away. I wanted it a little bit further, so this was a 3. I set it to a 4, so we'll move it in a little more. To be transparent with you, I'm not very good at doors. I don't like messing with them, and I was more than a little nervous to put these on, but when it shut perfectly, I was extremely happy with this. I'm pretty sure there's a right way, a wrong way, and my way of hanging these doors, and I'm gonna do it my way. So basically, I just got a rule that's 1/16 inch thick. You can just use any type of shim. I'm gonna lay that on the bottom, and then I'm gonna set this door in there and make sure that that spacing is what I want. From there, I go ahead and attach these. Once that's attached on there, I shut the door and I bring it as far up as I want my reveal to be. I want just about a 1/16 of an inch all the way around, so the door will close inside the cabinet just a smidgen. And then from there, all I do is take my pencil, go inside and mark the back of that hinge. And what's great about these hinges themselves is you can adjust them up and down, forward and back, and the gap between the edges, so they're super adjustable. For instance, you can see how thin this gap is. We want to match that one. All you do is open the cabinet. There's some set screws right up front. You just turn them to the right to move it closer to the cabinet. I marked and drilled holes for the door handles and then drilled from the outside in. That way if there was any tear out, it would be on the inside. Then just attach the handles all the way across. You can do a few things here. I put a magnetic catch in this one. This has a little metal bar on the other side. That way the door shuts and it doesn't go in too far. Or you can just take a strip of wood up here and tack on, and that'll stop it. Here I'm going to try to figure out exactly how the wing's going to work, where it's going to pivot at, all that. Once I had that figured out, I just built a basic frame, still using some of the 3-inch strips we ripped earlier. I'm going to pocket hole those together. Then I cut a piece of plywood to fit the top of that frame. Just use glue and brad nails to attach it. I then installed a piano hinge on the frame. Once I had it level and stable, I attached the piano hinge to the miter station. And because it looked really off that it didn't have trim on it, I went ahead and added walnut trim to the outside edge of this to make it match. For the bracing arms, the top of them will need a radius on it. I use a paint can to trace that out, and then I use double stick tape to stick them both together so that I can cut them out at the same time so that they match exactly. I drilled a hole that the bolt's going to go through first. Then I took it to the bandsaw and cut most of that radius off, and then over to the belt sander and sanded them both exactly the same. Once I figured out where I wanted it, I held it up right here and drew a line marking the angle. From there, I just used the bandsaw to cut that angle. Then over to the miter saw just to cut the end off so that it's nice and square, so when it sets down on the cleat, it sets flush. Make sure you use the lock nut here, that way it doesn't back off on you as you use the wing over time. I pushed the bolt through the hole, and then I put a washer on, then the brace, then another washer, then the lock nut. That way everything has something to slide against. I connected both braces together with a short piece of plywood that fit perfectly between the two. First test to see if it'll drop down like we want it to. Not exactly. I need to trim this piece up to fit inside. Extension wing. We're going to see if it sets level and does what it's supposed to. Look at that. Have a dance, people. Have a dance. For the finish, I'm just using Outlaws board butter. This is what we make here, but mineral oil and beeswax, it'll give it a good finish. Glue and stuff like that won't stick to it as easy. And when it hits that walnut, woo! So far, what's the coolest feature of this miter stand that you like? So one of the common questions I get, or have been getting, is how do I plan to control the dust on that wall? Well, I built this miter station and used this saw quite a bit building the station, and so far the Festool CT36 that's installed under here is collecting most of the dust. Now there is some dust that's coming out when I'm making like long cuts, in other words using that sliding action. I noticed there's a little bit of dust coming out up here, and how I plan to control that is with the old leaf blower. I'm in a wood shop. I'm really not that overly concerned about everything always being pristine. I do like to have it clean at the end of the day, but for for the most part, I can take a leaf blower and hit that and knock any loose dust off, whatever's gonna be up there. I'm really not that concerned about it. It's a wood shop. So here are a few mistakes to avoid that I made that maybe you want. The first thing is on each of these inside drawers, make sure that you set your pocket holes back far enough so that the drawers hide them. Right now, both of mine show the pocket holes, which I'm really disappointed by. I should have thought of that ahead of time, but I didn't. Another thing that I will likely go back and change now that I see it is I'm probably going to shorten this about 2.5 inches so that this is equal to this, so that it looks like it's all one piece there, or at least it's all the same level. A couple of things to note on this build. On mine, I wanted it permanent and I wanted to be able to level it because my garage floor is so unlevel. Because it is so unlevel, this end is higher than this end. I did go underneath and shim up where these two frames go all the way to the floor, just to give it that extra support in the center. What's great about this project is if you need to reverse it, in other words, your saw needs to be on the left, all you have to do is when you're building this, put this cabinet on the left and the two bigger cabinets on the right. Very simple. Or you can just move the miter station down and reverse these two top pieces. One of the reasons I split the hose was a good friend of mine suggested it. Thank you. That gives me the ability to clean up here whatever dust doesn't get collected by the dust collector. And because the Festool has the Bluetooth system, I can just push this button right here and it turns on the hose, and I don't have to worry about reaching under there and turning that thing on. And for the final touch, I'm gonna be adding this 731 Woodworks sign. It was hand carved out of a 2-inch thick piece of cypress by Eric Roten and his son. If you wanna go check out the video how they made that, I'll link that in the description below. If you like this build, go check out episode 1 where I installed the tool wall. Right there, click that box, get you the big old virtual fist bump. Also, if you want to see how I built my workbench, click that build right there, take you to that video.